Hey everybody. All right, so anxiety and inflammation podcast, second one, take two. So let's make a deal together. I need your feedback on something. I'm gonna touch some points, right? But as you can imagine, this is such a deep subject, like the rabbit holes are everywhere. So what I would like you to do, please, is tell me in the comments if there's a specific points you want me to go deeper into, right? Or if there's a rabbit hole you want to explore on this, because like the thing goes all over the place, right? So I'm going to try to stick to what I think are the main points and try to make them intelligible, because it can get very, very complicated. But I would love to know if you want me to go into specifics. For example, in the comments, someone said they like really that idea of the emotional aspect of it. So I'm going to go a little bit into that, but it would help me to have your feedback toward what point you want me to explain more precisely, right? So back into the idea that immune system and emotional response system are the same thing. So this is again that paper about affective immunology, right? Where emotions and immune response converge, that you can find on the Strongfit Vault. That is very interesting. And then again, they were saying recent compelling evidence has shown that the emotional and immunological systems share more than a similarity of functions. They want to say that they mirror each other. So I was making the point last time that they're both learning systems, right? So let's work backwards and see if we understand. Is it the chicken and the egg solution? So life started as a unicellular organism. If I'm not mistaken, it took 3 billion years to go from a unicellular mechanism to a multicellular organism. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure, I think it's in the billions of years, right? Because it took that long for nature to actually develop that idea that cells could work together to be part of an organism. After that, once they got together, the complexity of it rose extremely fast. It took 600 million years to get the nervous system to what it is today. Imagine compared to the 3 million years that it took to get from one cell, 3 billion years, then it took from one cell to two cells organism, right? So it's, you can tell, like, that's where a lot of the work was. And welcome to systems. It's always a hockey stick, it starts like this and then it starts to jump up. But most of the work is done very, very, very slowly to develop a system toward a certain level of complexity. But no matter how complex a system is, it follows basic rules that were started at the beginning when the system was very, very simple. So it's going to be the same thing for the human being. Is we have to understand that how we react is how a cell reacts. We have a more complex way of doing it amongst far greater, obviously, units, but also like interaction with the world. But at the end, the system is the same. Whatever a cell does is what a human being does. And so, for example, that idea, where do I go with this? It's a prediction observation model, as usual. That idea of Markov blanket. Humans have a Markov blanket just like a cell has. So that's going to be a very important part. So if we understand the life of a cell, I think we can understand the life of a human being better, and therefore understand how to deal with anxiety, for example. So does a cell have anxiety? Right. And here comes the immune response system versus the emotional response system. Anxiety is part of the emotion response system, the way we look at it. So what is really the learning mechanism here is how to deal with the world. How do we learn from it? How do we control the uncertainty of the universe? What was the first way for the original cell to deal with the outside world? Well, in a way, it was the immune system response of the cell, in the sense of something happens within the Markov blanket of the cell, which is the membrane of the cell. Something enters the cell. It's not the nucleus, but it enters the cell and is being attacked, right, to defend the organism against that. So if we can see that in the game of chicken and the egg, the immune response system is the first way of interacting with the world. Can a cell feel emotions? Well, and that depends how you define emotions. But anyway, you get the idea. The immune response system is just a way to deal with the world, right? And learn from it. just like the emotional system is, right? So we're going to see that's why it's the same thing. So how does a cell deal with the world? Well, that's the free energy principle we are talking about. The cell has a Markov blanket, the membrane. That means that the cell doesn't deal with the world. It deals with whatever the membrane tells it the world is. Just like the world doesn't deal with the nucleus, the world deals with the membrane. That's the principle of Markov blanket. And all this obeys the probability, mathematical rules of probability, not causation, probability of prediction versus observation. So we can see that the immune system would be the first step of prediction versus observation, which means that the reaction of the cell toward an enemy, an aggression, anything coming in, would be done from a predictive mechanism, not from a reactive mechanism, which means it's not just something enters, the cell reacts. It's every single time that happens, the cell tries to learn from it and try to become predictive about it, which is going to give us that idea of what anxiety is and things like this. Honey? No? Okay. 6:23. Okay, I'll pay attention. Right. So this is the mechanism that we're going to play with. So that means that the emotional response system is going to be considered the same thing as the anxiety response system. So from a practical perspective, what does it mean? So I'm going to go into the immune system response at some point because there's something called the killer cells versus the T cells and this like this. I think explains the mechanism very well. But today I want to be more practical about it. I want to talk about the emotional response system. So as we saw, the immune response system really is the same as the emotional response system. It's our way to deal with the world. So how do we apply that, right? What does it mean from a practical perspective? What does it mean for training and things like this? So there was a very interesting paper that is also in the vault that I will find for you guys that was showing that the 5 dominant character traits were linked with inflammation. So since inflammation is anxiety, or so I think, it's very interesting to see which character traits relates to inflammation, because then we can see that character traits can relate to more or less anxiety. Therefore, character traits, or what we can learn from character traits, can help us deal with anxiety. So now we're going somewhere. So what we saw in that paper is that the correlation that was the strongest between character traits and anxiety and inflammation, was conscientiousness and inflammation. People that were the highest on the conscientiousness levels were the lowest on the inflammation levels. So if we follow my train of thinking, that would mean that the people that are more conscientious are less anxious. Or so is it that conscientiousness is a way to deal with anxiety, which is what I believe, because at the end, inflammation and anxiety is the same, right? So conscientiousness means what? It means self-discipline, it means self-control, it means organization, right? So first of all, let me go into a rabbit hole on that one. I find it very interesting because when we start to look at control, right, self-control, we're talking about the 5th hierarchy of the system. So you're gonna have to go look for the podcast on the subject, but the 5th hierarchy is very interesting. The 5th hierarchy is when things start to become conscious. The first 4 from the heart, to the hormonal system and everything, all that happens on the unconscious level. The 5th hierarchy is when things start to go toward the conscious mind, so that you can start to look at priors and start to make a decision kind of conscious, like when you start to feel something, almost like a gut feeling, one might say, and start to make conscious decision based on instinct, I would say. That's actually the 5th step. Even chess players do that. Chess players that have studied so much can look at a position and go, this feels wrong. So is that instinct? Yes, but it's instinct based on hours of practice. So it's instinct based on priors, which is exactly what the 5th hierarchy does. The 5th hierarchy is all about using past experience, what is called priors, in order to make better decisions in the predictive versus observation model. Right. The 5th hierarchy involves the amygdala. The amygdala is very important because they tell you this is the fear control of the system. I would go further. This is not about fear, this is about control. You experience fear when you have a loss of control. So, going back to conscientiousness, which is self-control. Self-control allows you to deal with fear better, right? And that happens to deal with the amygdala, very interestingly speaking. And so that the best control we have of oneself, it's higher conscientiousness, leads to lesser inflammation in correlation, therefore lesser anxiety. So that means that self-control. So what do we mean by that? Well, for example, self-control of oneself, being organized, again, discipline, all that stuff. Are we not talking about an imam? Right, look at what an imam is. You're going to talk about organization. You're going to do 3 reps at that weight for 20 minutes. You have that much time to work, that much time to rest, and you move forward. So, and by the way, what is the Q-1? Q-1 is the quit. You stay right below that, which allows you to gain control of an uncomfortable feeling. So control of oneself in a difficult situation. Conscientiousness. Right, which happens to relate to lower inflammation levels, which means lower anxiety. So is that why, for example, Jordan Peterson was saying, make your bed in the morning, that leads to a better life? Well, in a way, if we look at it from that perspective, we could see that conscientiousness really is dealing with a somatic error, which is the point of the 5th hierarchy. Again, the point of the 5th hierarchy is bringing the priors into play to make better situations. That is the hierarchy that deals with somatic error. So remember also that somatic error, the gap between precision and prediction and observation, that gap in between, that is called a somatic error. The bigger the somatic error, the higher the anxiety levels. We saw that in prior podcast. So that means that the system is all about taking those somatic errors and try to reduce them, try to learn from them. You learn from them from priors, 5th hierarchy. So the entire idea on here would be that being able to apply that idea of conscientiousness would allow us to deal with anxiety better. So that means that in that particular case, I would explain why imam do so well, right, on the podcast, is because this is a form of self-organization of a workout that allows you to accumulate the small wins. So if we look, that's the same thing as make your bed in the morning. The key to anxiety would be to accumulate small wins. And if a win is too big to deal with, Q-1, we diminish the size of the win in order for it not to be overwhelming. So that would be like, from an immune response system, what is that? That's the idea of a vaccine. If the vaccine is too strong, you get sick. Or you get overwhelmed. Same idea, that gives you anxiety. So the key is, how do you make a vaccine work? You introduce a dose that makes you a little bit sick, but not too much. Q-1, exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is the best way to deal with anxiety. So it all makes sense now, right? So the idea is that idea of conscientiousness would be like, we're going to start to accumulate small wins that are never too big so that they become overwhelming, because then you're tilting the arch the other way and you do not get that self-control. You do not, because then suddenly the thing being so big is the world that is in control, not you anymore. So the key to deal with anxiety would be to be able to accumulate the small wins, the biggest possible, but never overwhelming, because otherwise that's like a flu that hangs around for too long and turns into pneumonia. So the way to deal with anxiety would be to first create a stress, never too big, Q-1, deal with it, heal, go back at it. We need to develop that idea of conscientiousness. So that self-control idea is the key. So make your bed in the morning. If something stresses you out, exposure therapy. You don't know how to deal with something, break it down to the smallest win possible and then accumulate a lot of smallest wins. That's what would allow you to deal with anxiety. What I find interesting with this is this would explain, burn the questions, right? Why burn the questions sometimes does not work. You know what burn the question is? It's a very chaotic moment that is one big win. That is one overwhelming moment that you have to fight and win. So that would get you out of depression, which is exactly what we see. But it would make anxiety worse because the win is too overwhelming, the disease is too big. It's not relating to conscientiousness anymore. When it comes to correlation with anxiety, we saw that conscientiousness is lower inflammation. Higher inflammation is actually neurotic behavior. The idea to see emotions in a negative way, right? So what they call anxiety, which is actually just looking at the negative part too much. That's called risk management, which we see more toward the feminine energy. So again, then you would see more anxiety in the feminine energy, which is usually what we see, right? That would be best dealt with through conscientiousness, small victory, organization. That would explain why anxious people are so organized, because that's the only way they can deal with the risk management, right? So by keeping their inflammation under control. So keeping your inflammation under control is keeping your anxiety under control. So it says there's going to be two sides to that. One side is going to be controlling, for example, food intake, so that you don't get an inflammatory response from the food. But you're also going to control the equivalent mentally by accumulating small wins in the Q-1 exposure therapy fashion. The best way to do that is protocol on one side, and then that feminine conditioning template on the other, which is really based on the imams, which is something to teach you self-control, right? And that's why the Q-1 I think works so well for me, is because every time I'm never, on the quit, I'm -1 all the time. So I'm always winning, always learning to control myself in an uncomfortable situation for 10 minutes. And then I just keep pounding it. But every time I'm like, no, you don't quit. No, you don't quit. No, you don't quit, especially at minute 6. And that is a victory for me. So I'm accumulating small victories for 10 minutes straight. And then that just brings my day so much better throughout the day. Is because I'm in the right mindset now. So I was testing something very interesting the other day. I was doing my work, and I know exactly what I have to do per the day. So I did that. And then the day after that, what I did is same thing, remembering what work I had to do, but I put it on a to-do list now. Same thing. And I did all that work, but every time I checked it. And I have to say, at the end of the day, there was a feeling of achievement I didn't have the day before. There was a feeling of organization that I didn't have the day before. My anxiety was less. And that feeling of achievement, I think, is what works so well with the Imam, and why it works so well with the feminine energy, because it is the conscientiousness we're developing, which means we are hitting the fifth hierarchy, which means we are learning to deal with somatic errors better, which lowers anxiety. It's all a loop. It all ends up in the same place. You know what I mean? So I want to go at what immunity is more precisely, because I think he'll give us a stronger feel that immunity and emotion response system is the immune response and emotional response are the same thing. But you can see how I think the inflammation equals anxiety is the key to all this. That means we can deal with inflammation and with anxiety from both sides. The conscientiousness control of your thing, the going away from neuroticism, is going to be as important as dealing correctly with exercise as it is dealing correctly with nutrition. If one of them fails, that inflammation is going to go up, and so will the inflammation. So I think all of this put the Strongfit principles together toward on how to deal with things better. So I'm very, very excited, and I'm going to keep making the small podcasts like that so I can introduce one idea at a time, and please give me a feedback on to which point you want me to go into more precisely. Cool. Thank you, everybody. Bye.